Hi everyone. In the last video, we were introduced to language standards. In this video, we're going to look at how we can move from our language standards to write language objectives that can help us in planning for language and intentionally teaching language features and functions to students in dual language bilingual classrooms. And I want to begin just by talking about the difference that I see between a content objective and a language objective. If you don't already plan for language objectives in your teaching, I encourage you to start doing so because they do have different purposes. A content objective I describe as kind of what knowledge or skill students are developing as a result of the lesson, right? So we're really focusing on kind of what the content is, what the knowledge or skill is that they are learning. Whereas the language objective is really more of the how. How will language be used to engage with and demonstrate mastery of that content? So how are we using language to develop that knowledge or skill, or to show our understanding of that knowledge skill, or to be able to produce texts, within that disciplinary area that we're learning. And so a few things to keep in mind when you're writing language objectives. You want them to be measurable or observable. So just like with content objectives, you want to plan for things that you could actually see if students are able to do. So if they're explaining something, if they're describing, if they're writing, if they're comparing. So what are some actionable things that they can be doing with language that you can then observe? They should align with your content objectives. So you should be thinking about language in service of your content objectives, the language that they're using to engage with that content learning. They're planned with your multilingual learners in mind. So in dual language bilingual education contexts, we're lucky that all of our students are language learners, but you especially want to think about the students who are developing that, whatever that target language is, who are kind of non-dominant speakers of that language, because you want to make sure that you're giving them the tools and resources that they need to be able to engage with whatever the content learning is for that day. I really like this term because you're also focusing on portable language that will serve students in other contexts. So kind of language you can pick up and take into another context. So as you're planning for the language structures or features that you want students to learn, thinking strategically about what is language that will serve them in my social studies class, but also in math, or what is language that will serve them, across multiple disciplines that would be useful for them to know, like learning how to agree and disagree and engage in academic discussions. And finally, especially for the purposes of this video, we want to think about them in relation to our language standards because we have great language standards frameworks that help us think about the language students should be developing at different grade levels and in different content areas. So thinking about how we can design our language objectives to be meeting these different standards is important. So I want to start by giving you here some examples of what it looks like to align content and language objectives, and then we'll move to talk about language standards. So if I was planning a language objective, I might begin by thinking about the content that I'm teaching. So here we have a third grade science lesson focusing on the states of matter. So the content area standard that might be part of this lesson or that students are working toward is students learn that matter has three forms: solid, liquid, and gas. The specific objective we're working on in this lesson is students will be able to distinguish between liquids, solids, and gases and provide an example of each. So you can see I distilled that down. It's much more targeted. They're not just learning about these three forms, they're distinguishing between them and they're able to give an example. And so what that looks like in terms of language is students will be able to orally describe characteristics of solids and liquid solids and gases using the terms definite shape, molecules, and volume. And so here you see exactly how they're using language to accomplish the content task, right? There's specific terms I want them to be using, and they're going to be describing these characteristics using those terms, which helps them show me that they can distinguish between them and give examples. So the knowledge or skill and how language is being used. Here's another example. Fourth grade math, two-dimensional figures. So the content area standard is draw and identify lines and angles and classify shapes by properties of their lines and angles. Great. The specific objective we're working on this day is students will be able to classify triangles based on their angles. So here we have, again, the knowledge or skill. And so you see it's more specific than the standard. I'm honing in on triangles and what specific way that we're going to be classifying them. What we're doing with language is students should be able to compare triangles based on their angles using comparative adjectives in writing. And so here again, we're getting into the specifics of language. You can see the specific language features we're working on, greater than, equal to, and less than. You can see the function of language we're going to be comparing so that we can classify, and we're doing this in writing. So as you can see, all of these they're connected, and the language objectives really get into the weeds of what that language will look like in order to be successful with the content learning. And both of these objectives were written using this very simple language objective template that I've been using for many years. You are welcome to write language objectives however it works for you. I found this to be really helpful because it distills it down to the core elements. So feel free to use this as a starting point if you want to start writing more language objectives. Students will be able to language function, content topic, using language forms or features in language domain. So how are students using language? And what would that language look like, or the two things you're thinking of. And then the domain refers to reading, writing, speaking, or listening. So what this looks like in practice is students will be able to discuss characteristics of polygons using comparative language, like both blank and blank have blank, in speaking. So you can see this helps me to plan the language function, how they're using the language, and the language features really intentionally. So I can begin to think about, okay, what is the specific language that I want them to be using and developing in relation to this content learning. And I hope you can see from some of these examples that language objectives are not just vocabulary. Yes, students need to learn vocabulary, but we know that at all levels of English language development and Spanish language development and Portuguese language development, language learners are developing language at the discourse level, the sentence level, the word level. And so as you're planning for what language to focus on, think about the different structures of language that students might need to compare, to sequence, to describe, that go beyond just the vocabulary itself. All right, and so here is how we then connect language standards to write our language objectives. So as I mentioned in the last video, WIDA has some amazing resources for helping us do this, both in terms of both the ELD framework and the Marco Dale framework, which are similar in the way they're structured. And so I can start with this standards document here. And we looked at the standard in the last video, and I can pull out my language objective from some of the examples of what those functions and features look like below. So if I want my students to construct language arts narratives that develop story with time and event sequences, complication, resolution, or ending, I can pull out this as my specific objective. Students will be able to write fictional narratives that develop the story with time and event sequences, complication, and resolution using connectors to sequence time, like first, next, and then, and events like before, after, and later. So you can see I'm pulling these specific examples from the standards themselves, and now I know what I want to focus on when I'm supporting students in their writing, right? I want to make sure they can develop the story with these different components, and I want to make sure they can use connectors to show the passage of time in their fictional narratives. Now, the reason we do this isn't just so we have a beautiful language objective that we can put in our lesson plans or put up on the board, but it's so that we can intentionally plan then for the language support students might need and intentionally teach language. So what that might look like for this specific example, to plan my scaffolds, is I might say, okay, I need to have a graphic organizer that's going to help students learn these different components, right? So here you see one example where we could identify the event sequences, the complication, the resolution. So this helps me to plan a tool that I might use to help teach that. To teach the connectors, I might work with students to develop an anchor chart. This is an example of a pre-made one, but I would encourage you to make them with your students, where we think about some of the types of words we might use to show the passage of time. And I highly encourage you to do some text deconstruction to also support students in this. I love the book Octopus Stew. It's also available in Spanish, Pulpo Guisado, but even the English version has a lot of translanguaging and showcases a Dominican or a Puerto Rican family in New York City, and through this fictional narrative that's really engaging about making octopus stew. And so if you pull out a text like this, you can look at the different language features that are used for sequencing and pull those out of an actual text with students so they can see how published authors do this in their writing, right? So here's a few that I pulled out. So later, then, back home. So we see that words like later and then are used, but also location words are sometimes used, back home, at the store, to move the story along. And so now that I have my language objective, I can think about all of the ways I'm going to support students to be able to develop their story using these components and to be able to use some of these specific words for sequencing in their story. And so that is why we use language objectives and why we have language standards to help us design those objectives. So ultimately, we can support students to develop the language they need to be successful at school.